Hey, this is the intersection where faith, life, and culture meet. I'm Eric Targe.
And I'm Justin May. And Eric, we are continuing our new series in season 2.
Season 2.
Season 2 series, Life and Breath.
Life and Breath.
Who are we talking to today, man?
Well, I'm so excited as we continue this series focusing on humanity at the margins. We're talking to someone that I've actually been following for quite some time, but this is the first time I've actually gotten to meet him. I've heard him speak on different things. We're talking to Matthew Soerens, who is the U.S. Director of Church Mobilization for World Relief and the National Coordinator for the Evangelical Immigration Table. Matthew, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, it's so great to be with you both.
Oh, man, this is exciting. This is kind of a big deal, huge topic that like warrants a long conversation.
Yeah.
I promise people watching or listening, it won't be.
We're talking about
long.
Refugees. We're talking about immigrants. We're talking about foreigners. How to love people who God sends to us, and we're in the city, right?
Dude.
Like we're in Chicago, which is an international city. People are coming in, and so like this is incredibly relevant to those who are going to the Moody Church or those who go to other churches in urban contexts, and because the nations are in our backyard. The nations are they're actually just at the wall right across from us, or sometimes they hear through our walls. At least in my home, I live in Chinatown in Chicago, and so
it's a little loud. So we're talking about care of the stranger, right? Like that's ultimately it. I mean, Matt, you have given your life to care and advocacy for the stranger. Can you tell us, like, how does one do that, and why would one want to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll maybe start with the why. In some ways, I think I'm a maybe unlikely person to do the role that I do, which is focused on refugees and immigrants. Sometimes I think God has to get you out of your normal place to get your attention. For me, what really got me thinking about issues of immigration was outside of the United States. I did a summer missions program as a college student in San Jose, Costa Rica. And I didn't really know what I was signing up for. I think I just didn't want to get a summer job. But I basically ended up playing soccer and leading Bible studies in broken Spanish with kids who were mostly either Nicaraguan immigrants or the children of Nicaraguan immigrants in Costa Rica. And I pretty quickly realized that there's a decent amount of discrimination towards Nicaraguans, and you'd hear things from some of my Costa Rican friends, even Christians, like, oh, those people are bringing disease to Costa Rica. They're responsible for all the crime. They're either lazy or stealing our jobs, or somehow both. And I didn't quite know how to put those pieces together, but it kind of upset me. I mean, it was like, I'm working with these Nicaraguan families. They're not bad people. They're not perfect people, but they're really normal people working really hard, trying to provide for their families. And it bothered me that I'd hear so much hostility towards them. And then I think at a certain point I realized, wow, that's actually, I think, what I've sort of been raised and heard about a lot of immigrants in the US. Some of the exact same ideas, but I don't actually know them. And I think it reminds me of when in 2 Samuel, the prophet Nathan comes to David to confront him about his sin with Bathsheba, but he doesn't just lead with, this is your sin. He kind of comes at it from sideways and shows him his own story in a different direction. He tells him the story, and then he tells him when he's adequately worked up, well, you are that man. And not that I was like an anti-immigrant zealot or anything like that, but I definitely, I'd frankly never thought about this issue as a biblical issue. Even having, grown up in a great church, I'm not unique in that. We did some research with Lifeway Research a few years back. Only 12% of evangelical Christians said that they think about issues of immigration primarily from the perspective of the Bible. Most evangelicals are far more...
Say that statistic one more time.
12% of evangelicals said that the most important influence on their thinking about issues of immigration was the Bible. So in fact, the Bible, my local church, the views of national Christian leaders combined came up less often than the media. By your own admission, frankly, in this research survey like this, you kind of expect people to lie a little bit. Like the Bible, if you're an evangelical Christian, is clearly the right answer.
Yeah.
Whatever the question was.
It was Jesus. I did it for Jesus.
Yeah. Okay. But only 12% said that's the most important influence. And that was true for me. I guess it never even really occurred to me that the Bible spoke to this topic. But as I was confronted with this ministry opportunity, I went back to the scriptures and was really looking for what might the Bible tell me. And the Bible has so much to say on this theme. And that's actually my own personal journey there has become my role with World Relief for more than a decade now. And with the Evangelical Immigration Table, basically helping churches, helping college partners, helping denominations look at what does the Bible say on this topic? How do we apply the different biblical principles that we find to the realities of immigration, especially in the US, refugees, asylum seekers, and all these different dynamics.
That's awesome. But I mean, for some people, that's really hard, Matthew. And I'm sure it was kind of a hard process in kind of translating some of those things. Like for our church, we recently went through the book of Ruth. And in the book of Ruth, we see just this radical love and obedience to God's command in caring for the foreigner and caring for Ruth, right, from Boaz. But I think there's sometimes a struggle for some of us because we're like, okay, well, that was the nation of Israel. That doesn't apply to us. Or it's like gleaning laws. I'm not a farmer. What does it mean to glean? Like, from your research, you've done a lot on this. And most people, again, like they look at the Bible, like you said, and they're like, oh, well, the Bible doesn't address immigration. How do those commands, how do God's words about refugees, about immigrants, because I don't think, we wouldn't say Ruth is exactly a refugee, more an immigrant, right? How does the Bible's word on gleaning laws and those affect our understanding? Is there application?
Great question. I mean, I think, the whole of the Bible, there's themes that apply here, but much of it is in the Old Testament and often in the books of the law. I think a lot of Christians don't really know what to do with the books of the law, because on the one hand, like these were not commands to the American church. These were commands to the people of Israel. And to be really clear, I'm not going to tell you, because of something it says in Leviticus, this should be U.S. immigration policy. Like I'm not proposing a gleaning law that should be this law in the state of Illinois. But the other way to go is to say we're under a new covenant, so this has nothing to do with us. And why even read it? Because it doesn't have anything to do with us. But this is the inspired word of God, and so it does have something to tell us. Yeah. I think Danny Carroll, who's an Old Testament scholar over at Wheaton College, he talks about how in Deuteronomy 4, the people of Israel are given the law, and it is to be so that they will be a light to the nations. Like there's something that law is to tell us about God's character. One of the most clear examples of this is in Deuteronomy 10, where God says, God shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. Mm-hmm. And if that wasn't clear enough, this is God's character. There's the explicit next line, which is, so you must also love those who are foreigners. Because of this is God's character, you are called to emulate that. Mm-hmm. And God's character in the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Exodus is the same as his character today. It's unchanging, and that is still our call to emulate that concern for the vulnerable. So, for example, the gleaning laws, I think some principles we get there. One is that God is concerned about those who are vulnerable. Who were the gleaning laws for? In Deuteronomy 24, it is the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. People who in that agrarian society where your ability to sustain yourself was tied to the land were not likely to be landowners because of their gender or their lack of father, or because they've come in from outside as a foreigner. And again, you see that in the story of Ruth, who's both a widow and a foreigner. But another dynamic that, so we have this particular concern for the basic needs of those who are vulnerable. Another thing that's worth noting is it wasn't the handout system. Those folks still have dignity because they're made in the image of God, and they weren't to do some work. And I think that's a lesson for us as we think about how do we serve vulnerable people well. We are concerned for their basic needs. We want to make sure they have enough to eat, but there might be better ways than just a handout. How do we help encourage people into work? How do we help people provide for themselves and to be in a mutually contributing to the community? Mm-hmm. But I think there's a lot there. There's commands about respecting workers, not exploiting workers. And God makes the point to explicitly mention this is for the Israelite, but also for the foreigner residing among you. And frankly, if you look at the workers who are not getting paid the minimum wage in the city of Chicago, they're disproportionately immigrants. Yeah. If you think about God saying you shall have a Sabbath's rest, and this is for the not just the Israelite, but the foreigner residing among you, it's even for your animals. I think it's fair to speculate that if there are people who are working 7 days a week in Chicago, a lot of them are immigrants in lower wage jobs. So I think there's a lot of principles we can draw from there without, I'm not going to say that gives you a U.S. immigration policy. If you just, read Leviticus 19 backwards 3 times, it tells you how many refugees should come to the U.S. We don't have those specifics. We need to use some prudence there. And how do we prudentially apply that biblical wisdom? But there are some clear things we know about God's love for the vulnerable.
I love how I love what you've communicated there, because I think it can be distilled in a way for Christians to understand as don't focus so much on seeking to apply God's law, but apply his love, apply his heart, apply his character. Because like the law, obviously we're not going to say you must do all these things. We're not going to require stoning. We're not going to require, because like that was for a time, for a place, for a nation, like all that. But God's character, I love what you said. That has not changed. It's still the same God. And when we look at what God says he cares about, what he loves, that should influence us.
And, I think it's also interesting. Several times when God tells the Israelites, love those who are foreigners, it's in Leviticus 19, Deuteronomy 10, it's because you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. And of course, I was not a foreigner in the land of Egypt, and neither were some of the people that were being spoken to in Deuteronomy. It was their parents, it was their grandparents. Yeah. But my grandparents or great-grandparents were foreigners in the United States. And I think there's a lesson there, and this is even in some of the liturgies that God gives the people of Israel to say, my father was a wandering Aramean, to rehearse that story of your immigrant roots for a purpose, so that they wouldn't turn around and be just as terrible to the foreigners who came into their land as Pharaoh was to them. Mm-hmm. And I think often in the United States, we remember parts of our immigrant ancestry, but we forget what is usually the hard parts, the mistreatment that a lot of immigrant groups throughout American history experienced. And the challenge of Scripture is those are the parts to remember, so we know how to treat those who come after us.
It's like immigration is this huge topic, right? It's a very big thing, because as you've alluded to already, there's different categories socioeconomically, country of origin, like the reason people are coming. There's a wide variety of things that are drawing people into the country. How do we kind of effectively love on? How do we treat people in different categories differently? Do we try and treat everybody the same? There's different needs. Kind of like help us think through what we ought to be doing there.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important to acknowledge that immigrants are incredibly diverse, not just in terms of country of origin, but you have immigrants who come in who are the most educated people in the world, and that's how they were able to come in. And you have people who were persecuted and denied access to any sort of education for generations, they came in as refugees for that reason. And so socioeconomically, just every way possible, immigrants come from so many different backgrounds. And on one level, I think there's still some commonalities there, right? Anyone from a different country is dealing with some element, sorry for my children, some element of culture shock. People are very often learning a new language, even if they are absolutely brilliant in their first and second and third language. English might be their fourth language. Yeah. Everybody needs friends. If any of you have spent any time outside the United States, it is really nice to have someone who will explain to you what's going on and sort of be that cultural broker. And ultimately, everyone needs Jesus, whether they know that or not. We believe that everyone is made for that relationship with Christ. And so I think, regardless of where people are coming from, there's this opportunity to love the stranger, to borrow the language of Scripture. On the other hand, I think if there is a particular orientation that we see in the Scriptures, it is towards those who are vulnerable. So that's not every category of immigrant, but might be the refugee who, even if they were well off before they faced persecution, has probably left everything behind when they had to flee their home. Or the asylum seeker who has the same story but hasn't yet been granted. They're in an interim limbo state in the United States, waiting for the U.S. government to determine that they indeed meet the definition of a refugee, which means in the meantime, they don't get support from any sort of governmental support. They're reliant on charity, or it's become very difficult for them to work lawfully. Even we've changed some policies in recent years that have made it more difficult for them to get work authorization. I think about Jesus seems to have been attracted to those who are on the margins, to Samaritans, people who in his society were complete outcasts. And I guess I would ask, who are those people in our society? It might be those who don't have legal status, or those who are Muslim and some people are inclined to dislike. Those might be exactly the people for whom we should particularly be showing friendship and God's love to.
Matthew, as we talk about just reflecting God's love to those who are on the margins, to humanity at the margins, I think there's a tendency among Christians to kind of go one of two ways, right? It's either, well, we just got to pray about it. And it's like, all we do is pray. And prayer is good, right? And then others will be like, no, we just have to legislate. And so we got to just go and we got to lobby. We got to call the congressman, call the senator. Also a good thing to do. Like there should be prayer. There should be action. Like these things need to go. But I think sometimes in doing that, we've dehumanized, right? And we've depersonalized the situation that is actually right next to us. It's easy for me to get on the phone with a congressman and a senator about the person who's living in the apartment right next to me, as opposed to actually going over and figuring out what their needs are. Do you have any advice, any wisdom on some practical ways that the church, God's people, can and should be practically loving their neighbor that is at the margins, either in the house next to them, apartment next to them, or down the street?
Yeah, I think it's so important that it is sort of all of the above. Like when we love our neighbors well, to paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr., if you see someone beaten up on the side of the road to Jericho, you want to help them to get help. But if the next day someone else is beaten up on the side of the road to Jericho, and the next day someone else is beaten up on the road to Jericho, you've got to ask the question of what's wrong with this road if you really love your neighbor. And that's where that advocacy piece comes into place. There are systems that are not working well, but sometimes we focus, I'd say for a lot of evangelicals, we never get to advocacy. We like to start just like, let's tutor the kids in our neighborhood. There's others who come at this, and actually picking up the telephone, making a phone call to my member of Congress is the easy thing to do. It would actually take my time and my emotional energy to invest in a friendship with the person next door. And also that's just awkward, right? I mean, Americans in general, I think we're not always good at meeting new people. And I mean, obviously you had a pandemic to this, makes it even more complicated. But, that's one thing, World Relief Chicago, we would love to help people connect to people. And some of our volunteer opportunities are more virtual for a season, but there are opportunities to befriend newcomers in our community who are desperate for that kind of friendship. And prayer, I mean, I think is the thread throughout all of that. And not just sometimes we can use prayer as a kind of a cop-out, like it becomes that situation in the book of James where it's, be warm and well fed, and maybe even say that to God, but we're not doing anything to meet a human need. But again, sometimes we forget to actually genuinely pray. I was reminded recently of a situation, this young man I met at the border, actually on the Mexican side of the border, Venezuelan, seeking asylum. Long story, I won't go into all the details, but in my view, he should have won his asylum case, but he didn't. And he was in a detention center facing deportation to a situation that, he was seriously concerned about losing his life. And then in the midst of COVID, I'd been praying for him really seriously. I just had this real burden of prayer for him. Shortly after the COVID pandemic started, they released him. I'm not quite sure the legal basis for why they released him, honestly. Like my legal hat, I don't fully understand. But I was so shocked to see God answer that prayer. And it reminded me a little of, when Peter's in jail and God sends an angel and releases him, and he shows up at the prayer meeting where they are praying for his release. And when the servant comes and says, Peter's at the door, nobody believes her. Like, no, he can't be at the door. Let's go back to praying that God would do this thing. But we pray without the faith that God could actually answer our prayers. And so I've been really challenged to ask some audacious prayers for some of my neighbors who are particularly vulnerable.
What a good word.
Yeah, man, that's super encouraging.
Yes, super that is. Thank you for that.
This has been a really encouraging, I think, overall conversation to have. And we are so glad that you're here having it with us. How can somebody who's watching or listening to this, how can people get more involved with the work that you're doing?
Yes.
Yeah. I would say real quickly, we've used this acronym at World Relief for a long time of PLEASE. So the first letter in that acronym is prayer. And again, that's not just because LEASE was not a great acronym. We really believe we should be rooting ourselves in prayer. The L is listening. So listening first and foremost to God's word. Again, that stat that 12% of evangelicals think about immigration primarily from a biblical perspective is kind of a scandal in my mind for people who would say the Bible is our top authority for everything. One way we've done that, the Evangelical Immigration Table has a Bible reading guide. It's on the YouVersion Bible app, or you can find it at evangelicalimmigrationtable.com. That's just 40 Bible verses related in one way or another to God's heart for immigrants. We're not going to tell you how to interpret the passages or who to vote for, anything like that. It's just, here's the scriptures. And then secondarily, I'd say listening to immigrants themselves. Get to know your neighbors from other places. Hear where they're coming from. And again, if it's helpful, reach out to World Relief Chicago or another resettlement agency that can help kind of facilitate those relationships. The E is empowering churches abroad. The more I work with refugees and immigrants in the US, the more mindful I am of really the hardships that are pushing people out of other countries. Many of them are Christians persecuted for their faith. Some of them are persecuted for their religious belief, or there's a war, or just extreme poverty. And in all those places, or almost all those places, there is an active church, but they're very often very under-resourced. And a lot of the work that World Relief does, I know we do this with Moody Church in Cambodia and in various parts of the world, is to come alongside churches in those other parts of the world to address some of the root causes that compel people to migrate in the first place. So that's something people can be a part of, is supporting that work. The A is advocacy. One definition of advocacy is Proverbs 31, verse 8, to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. And I just told you to listen to immigrants. So I don't want to put immigrants in this category of, voiceless people. But there is a sense in which, the elected officials who make public policies that have a profound impact on immigrants usually care a lot what citizens who are voters think, and don't probably care as much what non-citizens who cannot vote think.
Sure.
So those of us who are, privileged enough to be citizens of this country, I think that's a stewardship issue. That's not to say go vote for this guy or that guy or woman, but to say whoever's elected, we need to be encouraging them to prioritize the needs of those who are uniquely vulnerable. The S is serving locally. There's a ton in a city like Chicago. I mean, there's so many opportunities to serve, whether that's, I'm going to help with an ESL English class, or I'm going to be a friendship partner to this newly arrived refugee family, or, so many ways to be involved, but World Relief Chicago can help with that. There's other good ministries in Chicago as well. And then the E is evangelism. As we advocate with people, as we serve them, as we love them as our neighbors, which, by the way, we're called to do whether they would ever share our faith or not. But when we do that well, we often see people ask the question of why. And we get to, as First Peter says, to be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is within you. And I should add, plenty of immigrants are already believers. Some of them are persecuted Christians who will share the gospel right back at you and probably have some things to teach most of us Western Christians. But others don't know who Jesus is. And when they see the church loving them well, it is an incredible witness to who Jesus is. And we've seen people from Muslim backgrounds, from Hindu backgrounds, from various backgrounds make the decision to follow Jesus here in Chicago because they have been loved and welcomed by people from a local church.
Matthew, thank you so much for taking this time with us today. Thank you for joining us on The Intersection. I think both Justin and I, and I'm sure all those who are watching or listening, were deeply blessed.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be with you. Sorry again for my loud children and the state of my bedroom, but I think we're all used to this pandemic at this point.
It's the way it goes. Immediately before we started recording, my two sons, I think, about unplugged 4 different things by kicking them over. So it's a miracle that this even happened.
Well, if you enjoyed this conversation, please, if you're on Apple Podcasts, leave us a 5-star review and say something nice about us. If you're on YouTube, subscribe. And also, why not say something nice about us? We like people saying nice things. Press like.
Sure. Like, share, put bizarre conspiracy theories in the comments, tie Bigfoot into the immigration issue if you can. That's what comment sections are for.
Thanks for joining us.